Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jerry Miller. I'm the founder and CEO at Cloudticity, where for the past 12 years we've been helping healthcare organizations successfully leverage cloud technologies. And we're heavily focused, because of the healthcare emphasis, on helping clients achieve and maintain high trust attainment. The last time that I had a microphone in my hand, I was at a karaoke bar, so if I see your attention wandering, we'll see what happens. So, thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Michelle Peterson. I'm with AWS, and I am a security partner strategist on the Global Security and Compliance Acceleration Program. And our program really is dedicated towards helping customers trying to achieve their different compliance needs by leveraging our partners and providing informal advisory. So we're really a partner-led, partner-driven program that folks can take advantage of.
Okay, we thought we'd start out with kind of a brief just explanation of what do we mean when we say shared responsibility. What does that really mean? So, Michelle, when we say shared responsibility, specifically within the cloud environment, what does that mean, and what are some of the challenges that you see?
Yeah, so when you think about security in the cloud, it's really about understanding what the responsibility is and where it lies between the cloud provider as well as the customer. So the AWS, for example, is responsible for the security of the cloud, and the customer is responsible for the security in the cloud. So one of my colleagues uses this analogy, and I really like it because it really brings it home to folks when you're trying to understand where that responsibility lies and how you can put it into practice to make folks understand, because not everybody always gets it, even though it's very simple. So if you think about a homeowner association and having your house there, really the homeowners association is there to manage the streets and the sidewalks, and then of course you build your house in that subdivision, and you're responsible for that house and all the contents that are in that house and making that secure and ensuring that who gets access into your house, who's coming and going, those types of things. And then that's really how I look at it. That's a really great way to understand who's responsible for what in the cloud. And then likewise, just the same that you might say, hey, I want to have my lawn mowed, or I want to have a fence put up. Who are you going to leverage to come in and help you understand what the requirements are by your homeowners association as well as what you're wanting? And so that's where you can leverage partners like Cloudticity to come in and really help you out with that. So that's really, from my perspective, the explanation of shared responsibility.
Thanks, Michelle. The way we've looked at cloud over time has changed pretty dramatically, and one of those changes is more widespread adoption of serverless. Jerry or Michelle, how do these new cloud adoption approaches like serverless affect the shared responsibility approach?
So I'll go first, right? Sure, and then I can pass to you. So yeah, there are definitely new patterns in application development, serverless being one, containerization of applications. The original HITRUST model kind of revolved around assuming that there's a physical data center. Shared responsibility kind of divorced the physical aspect of computing from the application portion. And so the evolution of application development into serverless models is somewhat incorporated in that serverless still runs on a computer somewhere, and so AWS is handling that portion of it, but the monitoring of it, the error handling, the security management, the code management, all of that is the responsibility of the application developer.
Yeah, so what I just think about adding to that is if you're thinking about maturing from the traditional lift and shift and moving over to just fully managed code development wise, you just want to make sure that you're understanding that as you increase those, or as you mature in those services, that you're understanding AWS is taking on more responsibility, but at the end of the day, you're still responsible for that customer's data and that encryption. So it's understanding what that scope is, what you're really targeting, and then how you need to make sure that that's secure.
Okay, thanks. And Michelle, you jumped ahead on me a little bit talking about the CSP is responsible for security of the cloud, and the tenants or the customers are responsible for security in the cloud. Jerry, can you talk about how Cloudticity plays into that as well?
Yeah, so one of the biggest benefits of using cloud technology is that what you used to have to do physically in a data center, like rack servers and pull network cable and watch lights blink, can now be done through software. And so when you can configure your entire infrastructure through API calls, that allows you to automate the vast majority of what you have to do physically in a data center. And so through that level of automation, it makes repetitive services much easier to build, manage, monitor, audit, et cetera. And so you can automate security and compliance directly into the way that you build both your infrastructure and the way that you deploy and manage your applications therein.
Okay, and I'm going to direct this one to Craig. Craig, you know, your firm works with several organizations throughout their kind of high trust journey. Some of these organizations may be more used to these types of IT assessments, and most of them are usually used to more of a carve-out type of method. How do you introduce the whole concept of shared responsibility when they're not really used to that?
Yeah, I think I had the luxury of doing my 3-year HITRUST refresher training last week, so I think that was very timely for me because I learned there was some content in there on element grouping, and it all starts with scope. Sitting down with the client, understanding scope of the assessment and where things reside from a hosting perspective, and you know, server A might be different from group server B, and putting all that together is really the start of the conversation. So once you can start to really nail down the scope, you can start applying the cloud inheritance models to that. And that's usually the first and last place I stop. I look at HITRUST as assessors, we're the interpreter, and it's my job to make sure the client doesn't have to even think about anything HITRUST. They just show up to the party and we get them going. So.
All right, we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about something called a shared responsibility matrix, or, I'm sorry.
Do you mind if I add? I'd like to add to
No,
that
no,
comment
go
a little bit. For those of you who were here yesterday for the Shared Responsibility and Inheritance Workshop pre-session, we had a good conversation about how scope impacts the use of inheritance and shared responsibility in the HITRUST context. So I'm very glad you brought that up. And one of the questions was like, can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means? I get that scope is tough for any kind of assessment. But like, how does scope play into this? So the example I used, and I thought it was a good one to bring forward here, is maybe I'm testing some physical security control, right? The doors are locked, and I've got 4 facilities in scope. Great, that's kind of a big physical footprint for the assessment. But one of them is a colo, and the rest are on-prem. Great, so I'm trying to figure out, you know what, how do I get comfort over the security controls over that colo environment, knowing that I have to treat it differently than how I treat the rest of my on-prem data centers, where I can actually go and test that the door's locked, right? And so in that example, through inheritance in the HITRUST assessment, you can inherit the scores of that testing of that locked door in that colo. Great. How much do I weight it? The shared responsibility matrix we may talk about later says I can fully inherit that, right? But should I? No, I probably shouldn't, because my physical security footprint is 4 facilities, and not testing any of it and fully inheriting from that one colo provider would be inappropriate. So in that example, like a 25% weighted partial inheritance strategy would be very appropriate. And if I was testing that same control with only that colo in scope, I wouldn't use partial inheritance, I would use full inheritance, right? So scope is a key input into that inheritance strategy setting and understanding, you know what, as I think about the control performance, who's actually doing it, and how much can I cover, and what am I allowed to inherit, and can I? So thanks for bringing up scope.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the SRMs, or shared responsibility matrices. So Cloudticity and AWS have kind of their customized versions of those. George, or I'm sorry, Craig. Sorry, George. Craig. You know, how do you make use of those kind of in a consulting capacity, and how do they play into when you're doing a validated HITRUST assessment? How do you use them, and what are you doing?
Yep. So like I think most of us in the assessor game have realized that you should do readiness assessments before you even touch validated for your clients. Otherwise, good luck. And I could say what I see across the customers, we have enterprise customers. We do a lot of 1-2 workload, small boutique analytic. They have one application running in AWS kind of thing type customers, and I feel for them. I mean, the Gartner hype cycle is getting insane in cloud security. I think there's a new acronym every week. You have CSPM, SNAP, cloud workload, container security, all that stuff. What I love about partnering with Cloudicity is they do an inheritance model by providing those tool sets for the customer, and a lot of times customers will show up with containers thinking that cloud workload security from a container perspective is not a challenge. which it is, because everyone uses, for example, open source code, and a lot of malware in open source code. So if you're putting that code down in a container without the right endpoint visibility product, that's a gap to me, and I'll score my clients a gap in domain 2. So it kind of goes to show that the tooling needs to exist. I think a lot of times I spend a lot of consultative time transcribing the HITRUST framework to be cloud focused. Like the control might read very on-prem, very kind of endpoint host based, and we're going to have to put that control in. And you don't have to do that. Like we could go through HITRUST without doing that, but that's just something I refuse to do. It's part of that InfoSec consultative approach we take. And when we partner with Cloudicity, they come with the tools, they manage the tools, and the inheritance applies, and it's a full end-to-end. So I might test that one workload container client in HITRUST, and I'll get full 100% inheritance on domains 2 and 6, 7, so on. So for me, it's my best friend, the SRMs. I love them.
We love you right back.
Yeah, and so Jerry, you were one of the first ones to publish for inheritance and to get your own kind of customized SRM. How do you make use of your customized SRM, and who do you share it with, and what are some of the challenges and things that you've seen?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So when we first helped release the whole inheritance model to address the shared responsibility challenges, a lot of the questions that our customers or prospective customers would come back with revolved around which of the Cloudicity controls could be inherited by the customer. And the answer was always, it depends. And so each time we talked to a prospective customer, it was a custom engagement to figure out inheritability. And so the shared responsibility matrix, or the SRM, really makes that super simple. So for us, our sales cycles have diminished greatly, and for our prospective customers, the confusion around what the inheritance model would look like for them has been resolved.
Okay, and I know you've shared in the past in some webinars some statistics on efficiencies, ROI that you've gained from using shared responsibility. Do you have any thoughts on how organizations should be viewing ROI and achieving that when they're doing the HITRUST?
Well, come to my presentation tomorrow. We'll address that in full.
I jump ahead.
We've seen a tremendous amount. So upwards of 50 to 60% acceleration in time, significant reductions in cost, and maybe most importantly, a reduction in the amount of internal disruption when you have to take your people off of their day jobs to provide evidence through the HITRUST assessment process.
Okay, and Craig, you see a lot of your clients as a consulting organization. You see a lot of your different IT environments, and from a cloud security perspective, what are your thoughts on some of these cloud adopting organizations, and are they getting it right?
It's going to vary by maturity. Enterprise, it's the same gamut. You put security code analysis tools in, do SAS and DAS scanning, and you buy the Orcas, the Whizzes of the world, and now you have a data problem because you have all these vulnerabilities, and who's going to manage and remediate those? Hence, Cloudicity could help there. On the lower, smaller clients, the SMB boutiques, the ones that are getting HITRUST because the payer's telling them if they want to do business with the payer, get HITRUST certified, and they got that 2 workload application in AWS. It's the basics. It's having really good AWS IAM policies, so you have privileged role-based access in the cloud. It's making sure you're doing misconfiguration detection, so enter cloud security posture management tools. All those basics I rarely see. I see a lot of enterprise clients chasing the Gartner ball, with the right tools, and again, that's the data problem. So I think it just varies by maturity, but from a baseline, there's definitely, if you look at, and this isn't official, but the recent MGM breach, there's nothing official come out yet, but it all goes back to privilege identity. And so to me, I always start, looking at the privilege role-based access as the first piece of those good guardrails initially. And we spend a lot of time with those initial guardrail, like whether it's a cloud security assessment, just to look at those initial guardrails. I'll start there before I even get to like DevOps, pipeline management automation with some of those security testing tools. I try to stick to the basic hygiene type stuff.
Okay, thanks.
If I could just jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
An important point to remember with that is that while a HITRUST assessment lasts in general 2 years, if you're an R2, security evolves continuously and compliance requirements evolve continuously. So the RBAC that you set up on day one might have to be changed as a new threat emerges on day 30, right? And so in between assessments, your processes of keeping continuously compliant are just as important as achieving that first assessment.
Okay, and Jeremy, you mentioned scope, and when you're doing your HITRUST assessment, scope immediately comes to mind. So, Michelle, I know there are 161 AWS services in your assessment at this point, and everyone knows that those numbers only seem to go up. So, how can an AWS customer that's interested in inheriting from AWS, how can they work with you within their HITRUST assessment to determine whether or not what level of inheritance is possible?
Yeah, so we have a page out there that's the services by scope, and that can go down to various frameworks, including HITRUST, ISO, HIPAA, SOC, et cetera. And that gives you the ability to drill in and see where AWS has achieved various certifications. And then in addition to that, there's AWS Artifact, which under NDA, those reports are actually available to you to view. And then that allows you to have that understanding of what has been achieved through that assessment or that certification that's been achieved. And then in addition to those, there's also the customer configuration guides that are available in Artifact, and those are very helpful tools. So they map to 10 frameworks currently, over 100 services, and in there you can drill down by the actual framework that you're looking at, look at the services that are covered and the controls, and then look at the guidance that's provided in there so you know where you need to address that service in particular. And so that's a really great resource that's available for customers to leverage. And then in addition to that, to those 161 services that we have been certified for, you can look at the HITRUST CSF version 11, which they've been included in, and take a look at what level of inheritance there is within that on the HITRUST site and CSF, and then be able to know whether it's fully inherited, partially inherited, or not inherited at all, and what your responsibility is.
Okay, then maybe a follow-on question. How does AWS help their clients stay compliant, and what services do you have should customers consider to help them achieve their HITRUST compliance?
Yeah, so there's a number of services. So a couple are, of course, using partners. That's a big part of it. So you can always leverage their services, but we have a number of resources. So AWS Config allows you to assess, audit, and evaluate, and also remediate. So the key there is that there are templates available in AWS Config for various frameworks that you can leverage to start making what you want that environment to look like. And customize it to what you want, and then also look to remediate. So as that's evaluating and coming back, you can set it back, have it remediate back to what you configured it to be. So that's a really key resource for folks to use is AWS Config. There's also, of course, Artifact, which I just mentioned, and the resources there, as well as Security Hub, Audit Manager, which will audit and help you identify what the various risks are, and then you can prioritize those risks. You have Inspector that's going to look for those vulnerabilities. So like it's been said here, whenever you've gotten your certification or your assessment completed, it's not like it's just done and you just let it sit there for the next 2 years and wait until you have to do it again. You need to continually be assessing and looking and making sure that things are secure. So those are a couple of different tools that we have available.
Okay, thanks. Jump over to you, Jay, real quickly. And I don't mean to jump in on your presentation tomorrow, but when we talk about cloud compliance, moving from a static view to one of more continual compliance, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so continuous compliance doesn't apply only to cloud. Regardless of where you host your infrastructure and applications, you should always be thinking about continuously assessing your threat posture, your compliance posture. But cloud makes it a lot easier because, again, it's one thing to have a bunch of tools that deliver findings to you. It's another thing to actually remediate or address those findings. And in most data centers, that has to be done manually and through committees and that sort of thing. The cloud allows you, for the vast majority of findings, to remediate those not only automatically, but immediately. And so your ability to stay compliant on a continuous basis is enhanced by the automatability and programmability that cloud brings to the table.
Okay, Jeremy, we'll jump over to you. Over the last couple of years, HITRUST has introduced a couple of new assessments, the E1 and the I1. Can you talk about how those fit into the shared responsibility and inheritance machine?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things we thought about from the design perspective of all the HITRUST assessments, the new one being the Essentials 1 year, focusing on foundational cybersecurity hygiene type controls. And then last year we rolled out the 1 year implemented I1. Think about it as kind of leading practices kind of controls. One of the key design elements we wanted to get right was it has to enable cross-assessment type inheritability. And I'm very happy to say we achieved that. And so if there's a requirement that's in your E1 assessment and it is maybe being performed by a service provider and that service provider participates in our inheritance program like AWS or Cloudticity, you can inherit that control for your E1. And the same is true for the I1. And so the level of inheritance tooling and capabilities and SRM support that you've come to expect for the R2 assessment, HITRUST historical large assessment, you can enjoy on these not so large assessments, the newer assessments. So we went out of our way to make sure we got that right. And not only that, we went out of our way to make sure that there was an appropriate level of inheritability possible in those new assessment types. And I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but I want to say at least 75% of the E1 assessment 75% of the E1 assessment is at least partially inheritable. And I think it's a similar stat for the I1. So it's a non-trivial amount of requirements in both of those assessment types that can be inherited per the SRM. And I'll emphasize again, just because it can be inherited at full inheritance or can be inherited at partial, that doesn't mean you should in every case. Think about the earlier example with the COLAs I mentioned. But the ability to support that inheritance on these assessments really opens up the aperture for what's possible given different sort of cloud presence and cloud workload distribution. So we're really happy to say it's cross. You can inherit from an R2 that's published. You could even publish your I1 for inheritance if you want to let people inherit from your I1. That hasn't happened yet, but people have published. I1 assessments have been published. E1 has not been published. I don't expect a lot of people to publish an E1 assessment. I expect that to be more the recipient of inheriting from larger assessments, but it's possible. So you can publish every assessment type. You can inherit into every assessment type. And in the shared responsibility matrices that HITRUST released, I want to say the most recent one has a column at the end, if you download it from MyCSF, to indicate which assessments those different requirements are present in. So you can filter the SRM by show me what's in the E1 and also show me what's fully inheritable or partially inheritable.
Yeah, and then when was you got all the cloud providers, I know for sure Azure and AWS, but version 11 SRMs are released too, right? That was
Yeah,
about 2 weeks ago.
11.1, yeah. So all the major cloud providers, I want to say every SRM has been updated to 11.1. And what that means is it will support up to 11.1 and everything behind it. And so those SRMs, they're big, scary workbooks in my opinion because they contain every single requirement that has ever been in any HITRUST CSF version ever. So the CSF now has about 2,700 controls, but there's like 6,000 requirements in that thing because it goes back so far in time. Why? Because if you're on like a 9.4 assessment and you want to inherit from AWS, who's on version 11, I think, you can do that, and you can use the SRM workbook to figure out exactly how much you can inherit from across those different versions.
Okay, and staying with those, the SRMs that are then tied to the different versions, there was a recent update to the SRM baseline that took the analysis down to the evaluative element level. Sorry, I can't say that, but can you talk a little bit about that recent change?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've gotten questions about over time is, hey, HITRUST, we see that this requirement is partially inheritable. Can you tell us a little bit more about why this might be partially inheritable and not fully inheritable? Because I've got this special scope and I need to do this special thing. And we've offered the SRM types, there's 5 in the workbook that you can see, to help provide that transparency. But this most recent update we included, like you said, it's got a new tab in the 1.4.1 version of that workbook that has all the evaluative elements behind all those requirements. So there's a lot. And the use case is as follows. If you're looking at a requirement that is partially inheritable, and you're wondering, you know what, some of that looks inheritable, some of that looks fully inheritable, and I'm not sure if that requirement, if everything in there is inheritable, you can now sort of double click on that requirement and understand down to the constituent parts of the requirement, we call them evaluative elements, which aspects are inheritable and which ones are not, and which ones might be partial. So it's provided as a means of transparency to answer those type of questions. Because our audience is so many detail-oriented assessor organizations and compliance professionals, we got a lot of questions about, hey, I think this looks like you're moving the cheese pretty significantly on us. Are you going to start QAing differently down to the evaluative element level? And should we be charging double for the work involved in inheritance? And also, are you going to make it so that you have to request inheritance in MyCSF for every single element? No and no and no. Instead, this is for transparency to help understand and help build that inheritance strategy in that planning phase of the assessment, but don't anticipate HITRUST to take any kind of hard left turn on, they didn't ask that question last year when I used inheritance, and now it's a detailed way beyond what we expected. That's not going to happen.
How did you read my mind and put that all into words just now?
I've explained that a few times now, so look out for a blog post. Yeah, but it's for transparency purposes.
All right, for the HITRUST partners that are on the stage, are there any recent or upcoming changes or developments that you've seen that's relevant to this conversation? Not everyone at once. Yeah.
Yeah, so like so many things in the HITRUST world, it's not static by any means, and you'll hear in future sessions we're expanding our assurance offerings into the world of AI systems. And part of that we realized very early on is we can't enable the level of assurance over AI-enabled systems that we want unless we also extend our shared responsibility and inheritance program to include AI system type configurations. Because in that world, so much of it is being, the models are being hosted and trained and developed by the large cloud providers, but they have their own unique aspects that as you start to overlay shared responsibility and inheritance, you can't take the existing SRM types approach and the existing decision-making process that we've went to determine, can this be inherited or not? It doesn't always apply to an AI-focused requirement. And so we're extending our SRMs and we're extending our control set and we're extending the inheritability to include considerations over models and AI-enabled systems and how those AI-enabled systems may be using stuff that the cloud is hosting and that expecting controls to be there that the cloud provider, the model provider performed. So look out for that. That's pretty exciting. And Scott actually is going to be contributing to a lot to that. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, a few things that we observe at Cloudticity. One is ever-expanding adoption of HITRUST. I think the I1 or the E1 and the I1 has helped that quite a bit. But we're also seeing the complexity of HITRUST assessments grow as the adoption of a shared responsibility model continues. So if you think about the way that a modern application is developed, so we've got microservices, so you've got your code, you've got open source code, as Craig mentioned earlier, that uses other open source code, that uses other open source code. So tracing that back and building that map of every component of your application, much of which is out of your direct control, is exceedingly complex. And at the same time, as we build microservices applications, we increasingly rely on external vendors, right? So you're not going to build your own text messaging application. You're going to leverage another, an outside text messaging application. You're not going to build your own payment processing. You're going to use Stripe, right? So there's an ever-expanding array of partners that make up what your consumer would consider your application. And so getting that entire ecosystem into a common understanding of how shared responsibility works, and then layering on complexity of AI where you don't have attribution, you don't understand how the models work. We're super excited about not only the possibility that these architectures bring, and a little bit scared of the complexity, which is very much cushioned by the work that HITRUST is doing to kind of accommodate the way that application development is evolving.
Okay, do we want to open it up for how are we on time?
Time check.
Sorry?
Time check. Okay.
Yeah, I think we've got maybe time for
Okay. Question or two?
audience question.
Yeah. Anyone in the audience? Question about what we've covered so far? Okay. One question? Yes.
One down front.
Yeah. Is there a mic to? Okay. Carlene's coming with a mic. One moment. Yeah, great question. And one of the things that makes this challenging is the amount of coordination necessary between us and the large service providers, and between the service providers and their tenants, their customers. And that manifests especially notably in what versions of the CSF everyone is on. And so in a utopian world, everyone's on the same exact HITRUST CSF version at the same time, but we know that that's not how it works. And so one scenario is whenever the cloud service provider is on a newer version of the HITRUST CSF and someone on an older version wants to inherit. Is that easy peasy? Well, there's risks that as you move up to different versions, the requirements that you had in your previous version are no longer in your new version. And whenever we released version 11, we were very conscious that some of the requirements that are very, very commonly inherited in your 9X, so 9.4, 9.5, 9.6, we're not porting over to the V11 core set of requirements, which is comprised of the V11 I1. So how do we ensure that the 9.6 customers are not sort of messed up in their planning when they're trying to inherit from V11? And one of the things we did was released an optional factor called legacy inheritance support. And for every single inheritance provider, we encourage them, if you're moving to 11 and you've got customers or internal stakeholders that are inheriting from your assessment that are on 9X, do consider including that legacy inheritance support, because what we did was we went through and selected what are the most commonly inherited 9.x requirements that did not make it into the V11 sort of core baseline, and put those in that factor. So if you add that into your R2, those get included into your V11, and you're less likely to mess up the planning and the strategy of your 9X customers. So that's one scenario. That's not what you asked about. What you asked about is the opposite scenario. When your cloud provider is on an older version, and I say cloud provider, your inheritance provider might be on an older version, and you've moved up to a newer version faster than them. There's not a great answer, because the fact is, in the R2 world, we say, look, you can't carve out requirements because you've got to get the assurance, and then if you can't get the assurance of the control performance, you have to take a 0. We can't communicate assurances that we weren't able to achieve. So it's an inconvenience, and that's why a lot of the inheritance providers go out of their way to make sure that they're not only on the newest version, but they do their assessments more often than necessary. I think most, if not all, the big cloud providers do an assessment every single year to help avoid that problem, and they always pick either the newest version or like one of the minor dot releases prior from the newest version. So that's helped greatly. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. It's not the best scenario, but the coordination is what helps avoid it.
I mean, sunsetting version 9 below 9.6 will help.
Yeah, soon, I think.
One more year.
Yeah. Other questions? Great question. Thank you for that, by the way. Okay. Scott?
All right, thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.